Please pray with me. Our loving God and Savior, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Jesus is in the middle of his ministry, and whether we look at these teachings in the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Luke, neither of which were written by men named either Matthew or Luke, these well-known teachings, called the Beatitudes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, are likely known to people, even people who haven't been churched. They're quoted extensively, and for centuries they've been turned into happy sermons, always focusing on the blessings of living life the way Jesus did, with mercy and compassion. But stop for a minute and think. Who do you, individually, personally, who do you consider blessed? Our society would immediately jump up and answer: the wealthy, the famous, the successful, the powerful, the happy, the attractive, the serene. But who do you think is blessed? Once upon a time, there was a pastor leading a Bible study in prison, and he was about to teach about the Beatitudes. And he said, this is a quote, "My fear was that our discussion of the Beatitudes would be reduced to platitudes and sentimentality. But I knew if we really confronted the Beatitudes, we'd be talking about something much closer to life and death. Because the Beatitudes are some of the hardest and craziest words Jesus ever uttered. But how do we get that across?" He started by asking a question. Before reading the Beatitudes, he asked them, the prisoners, he said, "I want you to think of the Beatitudes that govern the world in which you live, the world here behind these concrete walls and barbed wire. Who's blessed in here? Who gets ahead? Who comes out number one?" So fill in the sentence, "Blessed are the blank." There was a pause, and there was some silence. Finally, a man answered, "The violent." And so the pastor said, "Okay, blessed are the violent." And he said, and then the floodgates opened. "Blessed are the thieves. Blessed are the liars. Blessed are the hypocrites, the manipulators, the guys who control the black market, the strong." And the pastor realized with a shudder suddenly that things are not so different outside the prison walls. We're going to come back to this pastor's prison visit in a minute. The Beatitudes are not cute and cuddly. They're dangerous. They're subversive because they threaten the paradigm of expediency and power, which are the pillars of empire and the essence and foundation of capitalism. They turn the world that we've been sold upside down. One author calls them, quote, "violent thrusts of grace that rip apart the lies that we have been told to keep us in our place." They reveal a God who chooses what the world calls foolish to shame the wise, and what the world considers weak to shame the strong. If we're going to appreciate the power of the Beatitudes, we have to look at the context and be aware of the context in which they were laid out. According to the gospel narratives, Jesus didn't preach the Sermon on the Mount to an upwardly mobile, well-fed, middle-class church. The text says disciples instead of the 12. Up to this point, the reference of the 12 disciples said the 12, the 12. Suddenly here it says disciples, which means that we're to understand that this crowd that Jesus is addressing represents a model, a paradigm of all followers of Jesus in general, including us. This particular crowd included the transient, the needy, the sick, the desperate, outcasts, widows, and the marginalized. When we read the Gospels, over and over again, we have to come to the conclusion that Jesus faced and embraced class struggle and the inequality of power. Yes, I just mentioned class struggle and power. And to those who say that politics has no place in a religious environment, may I refer you to our teacher, Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "Those who say religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what religion is." We need to always bear in mind that God did not become manifest as the privileged and wealthy son of a powerful Roman senator. In modern-day terms, he wasn't born at Mountainside and Glen Ridge and go to Choate and Yale and end up as a commodities broker on Wall Street. He was born in a barn to an itinerant carpenter and an unwed Jewish teenager in rural Roman-occupied Palestine. He was raised according to the law as a Jewish boy. He studied Torah and Mishnah, oral interpretation, Talmudic interpretation, grew up in Galilee, which was actually the location where the most religious Jews lived. They were a learned community, even though they didn't have a lot of money. He taught, he healed the broken, he embraced outcasts, he hung out with fishermen and hookers, and liars and traitors and cowards and Zionist rebels. It is made clear throughout every single step of his ministry in his time on earth that Jesus identified thoroughly and completely with the disenfranchised, the poor, and the downtrodden. The only harsh criticism and judgment he ever laid down was for those who had abused their power, whether it was political power, religious power, or economic power. Run-of-the-mill sinners like us, he told them that they were loved and to straighten out. Go and sin no more. He never said, you're going to hell. Go and sin no more. The Beatitudes, these teachings that sit alongside the Ten Commandments as cornerstones of authentic Christian existence, are a clear and clarion call for us to radicalize our hearts and to actively challenge the priorities of our sick society and our lost culture. It may be uncomfortable, it may be inconvenient, but the Christ demands of those of us who claim to be his followers a renunciation of many things that seem naturally desirable, and at the same time a readiness to endure a lot of things from which we naturally shrink. We have to remember in his own case, his great self-emptying was followed by glorious exaltation, so that in the case of us, his disciples, spiritual poverty and the bearing of that heavy, painful cross carry with them the promised inheritance of the earth and a great reward in heaven, however you define heaven. The word that's used to begin each of the Beatitudes is blessed, right? But the actual word that it's translated from is kind of more complicated. You know how I like to get into all that. It can mean blessed, obviously. It can mean happy. It can mean fortunate or lucky or favored or honored or welcomed. How fortunate are the oppressed? How lucky are those who mourn? How favored are those who have been made humble? How fortunate are those who hunger and thirst for justice? How lucky are those who are harassed for doing good? How completely counterintuitive is this? And that's because whatever your view is of Rabbi Yeshua ben Yosef of Nazareth, it can't be denied that as he was portrayed to us, he was a master teacher, a master of parable and of metaphor, a master of grabbing and exploiting each teachable moment. He knew how to get the attention of a crowd or of an individual or of any of us who open our hearts to these teachings. But the blessing of every beatitude is rested on an associated promise, right? If you think about it, it isn't poverty, hunger, sorrow, or suffering in and of themselves to which great rewards are promised, but those experiences as spiritual gifts being transformed into deep sources of rich spiritual blessing. And so when we read Matthew's version, because in Luke's version they're kind of more static, blessed are the poor. My father used to say, why did they change it to poor in spirit? You know, they didn't change it. There's two different versions. And he and I didn't know that because we were Catholics. We weren't encouraged to read and study this stuff at the time. But when we read Matthew's version, we see them stated for universal relevance, changing the poor into the poor in spirit, those who hunger into those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. So we can see that the real meaning and intent of what Jesus was saying, or was said to have said, is recorded in a way that all people in all times can truly understand them fully. And what most of today's first world Christians mean by blessed may be, in fact, very different than what Jesus intended. We usually refer to our condition, our social or economic status, what we own, what we can afford, what we're free to do, what we're free to avoid, our perks and our privileges. But the Beatitudes take that safe and secure interpretation that we've built for ourselves and flip them upside down. By announcing that the oppressed, the hurting, the hungry, and the persecuted are honored and welcomed by God, they challenge our assumption about what it means to be blessed. If you think about it, it's startling and surprising to learn that God wills to populate her kingdom with the poor and the persecuted. And we are blessed to have such people present in our midst because they are God's promise to us that she is turning the world right side up. In fact, Luke ends his version with these powerful words. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Let's go back to our pastor teaching the Beatitudes in a prison Bible class. He began to read the Beatitudes. He says, quote, "As we read these words, the room became very somber. In light of what we'd just been talking about, the radical call of Jesus shone like a white-hot light. It burned. When you read the Beatitudes on the outside, they all sound so nice and happy. But read inside a prison, you suddenly see just how crazy you have to be a follower of Jesus. How the Beatitudes really are a matter of life and death. I asked the prisoners, can you be meek, poor in spirit, or merciful in prison? Finally, they opened up. They said, no, you can't. You'd be hurt. You'd be taken advantage of. You'd be raped. You'd be killed. Your days would be numbered if you tried to live out the Beatitudes. He says, and suddenly I didn't know what to say, for it had become very clear to me that what it would mean for me to preach the Beatitudes to these men. I'd be asking them to give their lives to Jesus. I'd be asking them to die. So I hesitated. I didn't know if I was ready to make that commitment. And sensing hesitancy in my own heart, my own fear of loving and following Jesus, I couldn't ask these men to do something that I myself lacked the courage to do. None of this was verbalized. We started to talk about how in small moments here and there, they could let their defenses down to show a little meekness, to show a little mercy. We started to figure out ways that they could lift Jesus into the gaps and margins of prison life, where their shell of violence and toughness could be dropped for a moment. Basically, we talked about compromise, how to accommodate Jesus to the ruling ethic of prison life. I couldn't ask for anything more. Who was I to push them for more mercy and meekness when I'd be walking out of the prison gates in less than an hour? I didn't know what I was asking them to do, nor was I confident about what I would do if I was in their shoes. So we talked of compromise. I knew deep down that the problem the prisoners faced wasn't so dissimilar from my own. True, the metal meets the bone in prison in ways I don't experience on a day-to-day basis. But a life lived on the outside, according to the Beatitudes, is it any less crazy, any less radical, any less suicidal? And in the face of that call, have I not balked and backed down? Have I not been living my life the same way I encourage the prisoners to live theirs, trying to make a compromise between Jesus and the patterns of the world? Am I not trying to fit Jesus into my life when it's convenient and it costs me nothing? For the first time in my life, I'd read the Beatitudes, and I was afraid. End quote. That's what we do, isn't it? We fit Jesus into our lives when it's convenient, when it costs us nothing. We treat our relationship to God, however we define God, and to church, and to worship, as some form of therapy. Bulletin, this is not therapy. What Jesus asks of us, demands of us, if we're to call ourselves his followers, is to do precisely what we don't want to do, what we don't seem able to do, but we are fully capable of doing. Becoming transformed, to leave the things and priorities and attachments of this world behind, to take up our cross and to follow him. What does that mean? This cross, this amazing, great metaphor, rough-hewn, splintery, too heavy to carry, the humiliating weight of the world. But what does it really mean? Well, remember the disenfranchised? The original audience and stars of this Sermon on the Mount? They're still with us. There are so many of them. You know who they are. When we replace ourselves as center of the ego universe with these suffering ones, we have begun the carrying of our cross. To have the oppressed, the hurting, the broken, and the neglected with us is a blessing because they are the agents of God's transforming grace. When we join God in welcoming and honoring them, it changes us. When we offer hospitality to those who have been forgotten, rejected, abused, we're blessed to find ourselves among the Beatitudes in spite of ourselves. With God's abundant grace, we will be granted the courage and the creativity to be peacemakers in a violent world. We will find the courage to speak truth to power. We will become the sacred activists that God calls us to be, what Andrew Harvey calls warrior midwives of the coming era. These teachings provide an opportunity for all of us to acknowledge that God's grace always enters our lives in the broken places, in the cracks. To walk alongside the people named in the Beatitudes, to embrace them, and to stand in solidarity with them is the answer to the question, how do we take up our cross? and it's a way for us to be a blessing to others as well as ourselves. The prophet Isaiah said, "And if you give yourself to the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, your light will rise in darkness, and your gloom will become like midday." May it be so. Amen.